might even have a conflict on how that information gets reported because Chinese government will say, we need to know. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Caleb. I'm here with the incredible Stephanie Trunk.
I specialize my practices on all things life science, just incredibly broad if you think about it, in a global economy where we even have Chinese companies that have manufacturing sites in the United States.
I'm here with the incredible, the amazing, the not at the beach Stephanie Trunk. And my name is Darshan Kulkarni. But Stephanie, before we get started, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Stephanie Trunk. I'm a partner at ArentFox Schiff outside of Washington, D.C., not at the beach. And I specialize my practices on all things life science from the CMS and OIG lens. So think reimbursement and fraud and abuse.
We didn't see much in the context of M&A for like a year and a half. Like things were happening, but at a very, very subdued rate. And then things have changed. I'm seeing an uptick right now. What do you think changed?
Me too. Same as you, Darshan. And I couldn't really tell you. I think there's been, when we had the change in administration or maybe leading up to the change in administration, a little bit of nervousness about what that was going to look like, especially in the life sciences realm, and probably with good reason, as we've seen some kind of strange things coming on, especially around the area of drug pricing and some of these deals that we see going on between the White House and manufacturers. But I think at some point in time, I think the business had to go on. And I think because of that and the need to grow or change. But I am with you. In the last few months, I've definitely seen more M&A, shopping of assets, whether it be drugs or whole companies or devices, what have you. So I definitely think it's picking up again.
I'm now seeing more strategic, I'm going to only buy this asset class as opposed to your entire company right now. The other thing I'm seeing is a more strategic perspective, which is we're seeing companies going, you know what, we are going to buy into companies based in the US because we know that the Trump administration wants to see more purchasing and more sort of advocacy within the US. Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
So I think that might be the other element, which is you buy up the companies that are already manufacturing within the U.S. Is that resonating for you?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So do you think it's going to land up being more of the smaller companies that are being bought out as opposed to the mega deals we saw in the past where you have global supply chains?
That's another good question. I mean, I think we're always going to see smaller companies being bought up, especially, if you're a single drug company, for instance, and you have a desirable product, you can see that, and you have a mega company like a Pfizer that needs to make its, make its earnings. We're also seeing some of these more strategic kind of acquisitions like manufacturing facilities in the United States, or maybe buying contract manufacturing organizations rather than using an unaffiliated CMO.
I think single drug companies may find themselves selling now. And the reason is a lot of these initial phase companies were depending on the original model. The original model was we're going to get a bunch of NIH funding and we're going to get a bunch of overhead and we're going to land up getting it ready for a purchase in a phase 1, phase 2 type of situation. Instead, Trump administration coming in and saying, we're not going to give you those large overheads. We're going to push back. We're going to drop the cost of drugs. You're going to see these companies that were aiming for higher valuations suddenly go, I'm not sure I can get those valuations anymore. So it may be smarter to pivot out and sort of refocus in a different way. So I don't know where it's gonna land up, but I think the previous model of having 50 companies all pursuing sort of getting to your phase ones, that model may not survive in the same way.
Sometimes I think instead of focusing on just getting into a clinical trial and kind of trying to bring a concept from scratch, that we see let's purchase something established, right? And maybe in part that's due to some of the uncertainty that we see coming out of the administration. We hear about yes, we want accelerated drug approvals, but then we hear, No, we need more manufacturing in the United States. We need," it's a little schizophrenic. So I think because of that, that might be leading companies to say the safer route might be to buy something that already exists rather than try to make something happen in the pipeline.
I think that's exactly right. I think I'm also seeing you mentioned a really interesting thing which with the accelerated drug approvals, because the Trump administration just came out and said, if you manufacture in the US, we're going to give you accelerated drug approval, almost like the
Right,
orphan drug status pathway.
right.
And the first 9 of them just got awarded, which I think is really interesting as well. So
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how accelerated it is, especially given the shutdown.
So for those people who don't know, we're recording right now during the administration shutdown. You're seeing a lot of federal authorities. For example, during the shutdown, they came out and said that the CDC, a lot of people got fired at the
Right.
CDC, but that shouldn't have an impact, I would argue, on M&A transactions. What
Mhm.
are the big Trump administration factors that companies that were doing M&A transactions 2 years ago probably need to think about that they weren't thinking about 2 years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that is a really good question, and I will say, yeah, like, considering where you're manufacturing, we were talking about onshoring, but, like, country of origin, right? The country of origin of your drug, and not only where your API is from, right? But also where are you physically pounding the pill? I think both matter more than ever now, and we've got kind of a little bit of a divergence between what customs kind of considers country of origin for a drug versus what the VA might consider country of origin for a drug for purposes of selling on the federal supply schedule or under the federal government contract. So you've got to really pay attention and to both. And then, of course, it all ties into this emphasis, the onshoring and the idea of Buy America, right? And if you w- thinking about the worth of that asset, if you're able to say that either both or want, API and the pill is finished in the United States, or at least one is, and how that might impact your positioning in terms of not only tariffs and tax, but like we just talked about, whether that puts you in the front of the line for accelerated drug approval.
Enjoying our content? We'd love to hear more. Please like, comment, share, and find more.
This isn't really a new thing, but something that's come up is a lot more for me in due diligence from a pricing lens is thinking about pricing, which, sometimes that used to be people wouldn't even pay attention to government price reporting until after they bought the company. But I've had more and more questions about government price reporting, whether that be average sales price, and are we able to reset average sales price in some way, and how could we do that? Considering now we have inflation rebates under Medicare, so thinking about that and thinking that through and its impact financially on the asset, and of course the good old Medicaid cap removal. We used to have a cap on Medicaid rebates that actually went away uh, under a statute that was passed under Trump 1.0, that has become more and more of a focus. And I think sometimes that's why I see certain products up for sale as well, because they're kind of trapped with they're no longer as profitable to the legacy company because of the increased Medicaid rebates, low 340B price, and all those things. So I'm seeing a lot more focus on pricing. And then, of course, just thinking about how it fits into the bigger conversation about drug pricing. You know, is this going to make me get on the do I get to a size or such a drug that I'm going to be on the radar of the administration, whether that be for direct negotiation later down the road under the Inflation Reduction Act for Medicare D, or just in general? Like, am I going to be the 18th manufacturer that gets a letter from the Trump administration that says, hey, we think you need to lower your prices? What are you going to do for us in order to avoid tariffs or what have you? So it's been an interesting time. And I think people are being more thoughtful in due diligence, which I always think is valuable. So, what about you? What about you, Darshan? Anything new from the FDA or the enforcement lens that people are focusing more on now, given the change of administration?
I think it's been broader for me. So I'll start with, for example, I just did a transaction with a client. And they had a pre-existing partnership with a Chinese company, and that raises all kinds of flags because you're
Yes.
going the Trump administration is not happy with China, but they also have come to realize that they need China quite a bit. So, how do you, for example, deal with the bulk data rule? And how do you transfer data for adverse events to
Mhm.
China? Because you're going to have to report that, and at the same time comply with the data security rules that go along with it. For those people who don't know, there's this whole new rule that's not coming from OCR, for example, not from the Health and Human Services. Instead, it's coming from the Department of Justice, and they're saying
Mhm.
that patient information is something that the Trump administration cares a lot about. And whether you're talking about biometrics, you're talking about adverse events, they have to be managed very, very carefully. And the reconciliation part of it, you might even have a conflict on how that information gets recorded because the Chinese government will say, we need to know if our label needs to be updated. So if you're doing a transaction globally, keep that in mind. The US Biosecurity Act, they're looking now at
Yeah.
how are you going to partner with it from an IP perspective. And that's, we
Right.
don't really know how it's going to play out because it's still the first version of it.
What it would do is basically not allow you to have any touch to a Chinese company anywhere, like, in the chain of making a drug, right?
Yeah,
And that's incredibly broad if you think about it in a global economy where we even have Chinese companies that have manufacturing sites in the United States.
exactly right. I'm seeing small diagnostics companies and global multinational companies all dealing with direct to patient stuff, and they're going,
Mhm.
how do we directly sell to the patients? So if you have that structure in place, how do you manage patient information? Because companies have always said, we don't want patient information. We don't want to be involved. We don't want to be in that business at all because we don't want to be subject to HIPAA. And yet now with these engagements there are like a billion different ways these things get done, but we you want this direct relationship with the patient. So I think that's the future where you are going to have that direct relationship. um but how that gets managed is going to become a whole new thing. You mentioned sourcing, which I think is going to become a really interesting piece. You actually said this in the previous conversation before we started recording, but connecting it to the Sunshine Act, because I know talking to a lot of my DOJ friends, they're looking at Sunshine
Yeah.
Act and they're going, we're going to mine publicly available data. Why wouldn't
Yeah.
we? You take that same information, you tie it to the um, the complete response letters, CRLs, that are now publicly available. That's going to raise all kinds of questions that maybe you should be doing research on before you purchase a company, and that's going to raise its own sort of concerns. You take promotional compliance just to add on to that. You look at the engagement with influencers, and you're seeing a lot of that happening recently. Compliance there is going to become a major concern. And then there's obviously the GMP issues that go along with it. Who owns the product? When is there a change in title?
Mm.
Who and I see this all the time with manufacturers. They kind of go, our distributors say it's okay, except you actually have the liability. So your people aren't doing the analysis to go, um, who's responsible for selling the product? Who needs to be registered in the different states? And if that registration isn't done properly, who's actually responsible? Because states, my experience tends to be they typically, and that's not always the case, but they typically aren't the most aggressive ones. The DOJ will
Right.
do something, and then states will say, "We'll just pile on because we don't have to pay for the same costs." So that's been a really interesting thing for me, um, as I continue. Anything else that stood out for you as we continue?
You brought up a good point of publicly available data, and I think it's really important in doing due diligence that you're looking at that in tandem with doing your diligence review,
Yeah,
right? So if you're getting all these quality reports, for instance, in a data room, and they're saying everything's great, but then they have a warning letter, you should be able to map the fact that if they have a warning letter to what they've got in the data room. And I think this comes up a lot in my realm in sales and marketing practices matching to Sunshine Act reporting. Because if they're doing all these speaker programs and they're paying all these doctors to be speakers or their meals, that better be tracking to the Sunshine Act reporting. And if it's not, there's some sort of disconnect and there's got to be a reason for that. And it could be a very big red flag on compliance, right? They could be hiding things or not reporting things. So I think that that's a a good safeguard is to always be kind of going through the data room, but also be doing your own research on things that are publicly available at the governmental level and otherwise. And getting back to Sunshine, this is a really interesting one. It comes up a lot with device due diligence. Sometimes smaller companies get into device. They were tech companies, then they started making like a monitor, right? And it's used to read scans or something. And then all of a sudden they're a healthcare company and they don't even realize that they have a reimbursable device product and that has triggered the obligation to Sunshine Act report. So that would be a good one. Like it's a good example of you're doing device due diligence and there's no Sunshine Act reporting and the question becomes why. So yeah, definitely using those public sources is always a good check on your own due diligence work.
I think there's been an uptick in fraud and compliance enforcement
For
from the
sure.
DOJ. The DOJ is coming out and saying that we want you to have a compliance program. And
Yes.
and the truth is, I don't know any companies that actually have these compliance programs in place. However, if you don't, you're gonna end up having potential successor liability. And, unless you go out there and self-disclose, which not many companies are doing, even though there's a really good opportunity to do this right now, given that they're saying, "We'll put out non-prosecution on the table," which
Right.
and you're not seeing enough of that. We've seen a couple of those non-prosecution agreements that came out of it, but I think that that would be a smart move to consider in your back pocket as you're doing the due diligence transaction. Then,
Yeah.
if you look at the employment agreement, the employment pilot program, where they said that we want to see clawbacks, and you're not seeing enough of those clawback program enforcement, which is if you have executives who are not
Mhm.
being compliant, you need to have their employment agreements updated that says that for lack of compliance, we're going to take your bonuses back. You're just not seeing that. Another element, I think, is being aware of the whistleblower laws, which the DOJ is now sort of hardcore pushing because we're going to give whistleblowers the money and they're going to report on you. So, what does that actually mean? And then there's the successor liability that comes into play.
We saw a little bit of a law in healthcare enforcement. I want to say like COVID time,
Hmm.
right? And maybe it's just because it was COVID,
Hmm.
and everything was strange then. But we did see a little bit of a law, but there's definitely renewed emphasis, and it's you are spot on. It's interesting to see it coming not only from OIG now, but from like it's coming at us from all sides in terms of fraud and abuse enforcement and compliance. So that is still, and
Follow our page on LinkedIn.
I also think that's an under kind of reviewed area during diligence. Sometimes, it's a check the box. Do we have the 7 elements of a compliance program? Do we have policies? But really trying to dig in and understand culturally, if you're buying the whole company, you know, is there a culture of compliance there? And what does that look like? Do people go to the compliance officer or are there hotline calls? Are there at least logs of compliance concerns? Is it really just a paper program or are they really monitoring and auditing and just kind of figuring out who if is it really just a sales organization and they're kind of running the show and the rest of it's kind of behind the scenes? If you're buying that whole company, you're going to be inheriting that. Even if you have a really compliant company, trying to pull them in and integrate them could be very difficult when they're kind of a little bit more rogue. And you certainly see that, I mentioned the device space. Sometimes you see that in the device space just because they grew up as an IT company. So if you're a traditional life sciences company that's been in the space for a long time with a really robust culture of clients, and then all of a sudden you're inheriting all these sales guys who are viewing themselves as techies, you are going to have integration problems. Not saying don't do the deal, just know that you're going to have integration.
A lot of the deals I'm seeing compliance is a nice to know, but they're not deal killers yet, surprisingly. People are still generally going, good to know. We'll insure against it. We'll even ask for
Right.
indemnification. It's
Yep.
not going to kill the deal. Is that still the perspective you're seeing, or am I just dealing with that type of client?
No, it's still the perspective I'm seeing. I don't think we've, like, as mentioned before, I'm starting to see more and more focus on drug pricing,
Right.
which is cool because I think that was historically kind of an uh, uh, under under uh under reviewed area
Yeah.
prior to buying a company. But I would agree. I find that still it's pretty it can be pretty cursory in terms of compliance due diligence. And I don't know why that is, given the, as you so rightly pointed out, the potential exposure under criminal statutes related to compliance.
The other thing that jumps out at me is the FDA between Makari and between Vinay Prasad and everyone else. I find it fascinating that they're saying that we're going to be really, really focusing on clinical research and on healthcare fraud and on promotional compliance. And interestingly, they're using AI, and I'm not seeing anyone talk about using AI in due diligence. I think it's a little early,
Yeah.
but I'm curious on your perspective. Do you think AI has a role in due diligence as we continue?
At the very least, if you had a whole stack of contracts in a data room,
Hmm.
you could use a tool to help you summarize them, right? Now, I always worry. I mean, I sometimes use AI to do that, or to compare testimony,
Yeah.
right? Like a depo to another interview, and see what the differences are. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. And I think that that's kind of where we are with AI right now. If, sometimes it's a good starting point, but I also know that it's wrong in certain instances. And so, I mean, I think you have to be mindful of that when you're doing diligence, that the summary, you're kind of checking a little bit of the summary back to the originating document. But I do think there's a role there. Um, and we certainly are eventually going to see it. And I also think you're spot on. I do think the government I think Doge used it. And I think they are still using it. And I'll give you an example. If a drug was reimbursed under Medicare Part B, the Medicare portion of CMS didn't necessarily know whether they had a Medicaid rebate, but I see that being mapped together. And that's a good example. Just automatic mapping of what's in the Medicaid system drug wise to the FDA drug listing, and automated messaging if there isn't a match. Like those, and then it sends an automated message, and maybe sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong, or there's a reason, but then the government gets more information from your response. So the government is definitely using it. I imagine they'll start to use it more in enforcement. Maybe they'll match something up to the Sunshine Act database, or what have you, as we go on in time. And I think we will also see tools be used to help summarize data in data rooms related to due diligence.
I'm gonna end this with a pet peeve of mine, and I'm curious if you share this pet peeve or it's been a non-factor for you for the most part. But whenever you do the IP due diligence, right, you always find here's my list of patents and copyrights and blah blah blah, and I always go, okay, how many of those translate into anything that I'm actually buying? And you never get that translation, you never get that mapping. I own 50 patents, okay, and how many of those impact the 5 products I'm buying?
Yeah.
And I never see that. And I'm just curious, is that just a pet peeve, or does everyone else sort of share some of those? Like you're like,
So
I
I
have a
didn't
bigger
have
fish
to
to
do
fry.
the actual patent due diligence because I'm not a patent lawyer, but
Right.
but I think that is I think an excellent point. And I think that is an area where it also has relevance to, like, can you tie the patent to the FDA approval to the drug category in
Right?
Medicaid? Like, that's another area where we could see AI kind of coming into play. And maybe there would be an AI tool that would help get over your pet peeve and map up the patent to the drugs.
Or appropriately, and my experience is more that they don't want to, because you might find out that the IP doesn't match up to
Yeah,
the actual
yeah,
regulatory purchases, and that's okay. That's
yeah,
completely okay. But then you go, I'm not paying you for the IP because it has no value for me.
Right.
Instead, what I'm going to buy is the exclusivity. I'm going to buy the market
The
share,
approval.
the
Yeah, the market
approval.
approval. Yeah.
That's the actual value I'm buying. And knowing that is, I think, important in purchasing a company. But before we go, Stephanie, because we're almost at the 30-minute mark, how can people reach you?
Via email, stephanie.trunk@afslaw.com, or you can Google me. I come right up. And I do speak and write a lot on life science topics on our blog, and you can sign up for alerts from our blog, from our website.
Very cool.
How
And
about you, Darshan?
you can reach me at Darshan, Darshan, at kulkarnilawfirm.com. I really should find a way of making it shorter. That's Darshan at kulkarnilawfirm.com. Or you can find me, for example, on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only Darshan Kulkarni on there. I could be wrong. And we welcome questions. We welcome conversations. And I look forward to hearing from you guys. Thanks, everyone.
Call, click, or email